I think you're seeing something very dangerous, which is the collapse of the pretense of democracy, that the imposition of what America would, well, in many, what I call a two-party dictatorship. But what you have in the United States and Britain is a two-party dictatorship. The word is hubris. Hubris is a Greek word, and it was actually it rose to the center in ancient Athens at the time when there was a very big sort of revolutionary process going on. The dictatorship of Draco had provoked a sort of meltdown of the Athenian economy, and I'm going to come on to that because there are parallels in terms of economy. But anyway, then the citizens of Athens and the surroundings asked a man called Solon to create a set of laws for Athens. So Solon actually abolished debt enslavement, which was a phenomenal step and is still very relevant today. Then he introduced a series of measures to correct the balance in terms of the power of the aristocracy that was being abused and misused. And the Athenian constitution introduced a law against hubris. Now, not many people know it's a law. In the West, the word just simply is taken to mean arrogant pride. Hubris, I think, is the correct pronunciation, but I'm not a Greek scholar, so sorry to any Greek scholars listening. Arrogant pride. Now, in mythology in Greece, arrogant pride is punished by the goddess called Nemesis. And Nemesis exacts vengeance on people who have been guilty of arrogant pride. But the crime of arrogant pride was you could actually take somebody to court in Athens for arrogant pride, which means you abused the power that you possessed against a poor person. So it was a law specifically introduced to rectify the imbalance between the power of the rich aristocrats who were actually ruining the economy because they misused and abused the power. But the issue was whether they should have power at all, which is what we confront today. So it was a crime because that was the way that Solon thought it was possible to rectify these imbalances and save the Athenian economy and polity. Now, why is that relevant today? Because what we see is hubris in terms of the imperial rulers of the world. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the special military operation, if you think about it, what things people were saying at the time, they said, Biden said, the Russian economy will be asphyxiated. The commentators, sort of slightly before the beginning of last year, but it's a continuous process, that Russia is isolated, that sanctions will destroy Russia, that Russia will be defeated and crushed. This didn't happen. Now we see, on the contrary, after resistance of the Palestinian people on October the 7th, and the ongoing consequence of that the arrogant pride of the current prime minister, the current president of Israel, of Netanyahu, is being punished by Nemesis because he believed that it was everybody believed, and the Zionist state is what I will call it, of Israel, managed to convince the world, many people who didn't like what it was doing, that it was invincible, that it was invulnerable, that nothing could be done to stop it. This was not the case. That myth was shattered by those events. So that events, both in Ukraine and in the world economy, and in Ukraine, the world economy, in Palestine, in Israel, have been shattered, that the illusions that people had that they were all powerful, mighty, that they would carry all before them, they were invulnerable, Iron Dome would protect you against any possible attack, is shattered. So the pride, the arrogant pride has been punished. But I'll finish on this point. The punishment has actually been inflicted in Greek mythology. Punishments are often inflicted by either heroic figures or mythical figures, such as Nemesis, which is incarnated in the person of a goddess. The goddess in this case is the economy, that the hubristic belief that their economies are superior to all other economies in the world, and therefore they have the right to impose that economic system on the world, that they have the ability to impose that economic system on the world, that they can force the rest of the world to trade with them under circumstances of their choosing, even though this impoverishes the vast majority of people in the world. that is being punished because their own economies are declining and continue to decline. And this is something that's often forgotten because it's portrayed by the people of the West as if the problems in their economy is something that is being done to them, that it's the Putin price hike that caused inflation, that it's I don't know, the sort of now the latest culprit are the Houthis. So a tiny, very poor, very battered, but very brave and courageous people in the corner of the Arabian Peninsula are now responsible for the collapse of world shipping and the world economy. Well, they've certainly done some damage to those parts which were dependent on the oil trade. But they're not the ones responsible for the economic crisis. This is something these countries have done to themselves. And that, to me, is why the word hubris, not merely because of the visible form, which is these political and military setbacks, but the fact that the economies of the countries who rest their claim to their pride on what they consider to be the superiority of their economic systems have got the shock of finding that, first of all, those economic systems are not anymore accepted by the rest of the world, which is why we have the formation and strengthening of the BRICS and alternative trading alliances. But second, these economies are not recovering. They're not forging ahead. There's a lot of very almost falsified, but I would say sort of wishful thinking economic data, which is pumped out by their agencies. But they're not working. These economies are not working. And that's why many countries are opting to look for economic alternatives, above all, alternative economic alliances. And that, to me, is one of the most, well, economic and political, but one of the most significant and central outcomes of this year. It makes the world a very dangerous place. I don't think it will create anything that I would recognize as a revolution. It creates political chaos. What you have is what I call a moral crisis. A moral crisis is when people believe that certain remedies will achieve certain ends, and therefore these ends are good, and they're justified, therefore, in carrying out these things, and they don't work. So then first of all, people say, well, somebody else was responsible. You always look around to blame somebody else, especially if you're very powerful and mighty, because you can't believe that you yourself might have weaknesses. That's one of the sins of hubris, is the inability to recognize one's own weaknesses. But the result is political chaos, and the moral crisis we're now facing is, in my opinion, a moral crisis of Western liberal democracy. That what is being shown up is that that system is not democratic. It doesn't live up to its own claims. I'm not saying democracy is wrong. What I'm saying is Western liberal democracy is not democratic. And this is now becoming very clear. All the liberal values which Western liberal democracy, representative parliamentary democracy, let's call it, was supposed to achieve, are one by one falling. Freedom of speech. Julian Assange has been imprisoned without any legitimate charges being directed against him for 8 years. That's something that's happened to democracies. The two leading self-proclaimed leading democracies of the world, the United States and the United Kingdom, have worked together to bring this about. But you also see the chaos in the American political system. That basically both Biden and Trump now have among the lowest approval ratings, I think, in history, certainly for a very long time. I've been trying to follow the polls, so I may be corrected on whether it's the absolute low. It's certainly not very good. Well, how are they dealing with this? They're not dealing it by confronting the truth. They're not dealing with it by coming out with what's really happening. To the contrary, when people protest and say that this is a genocidal assault on the people of Gaza, when they say South Africa is right to take Israel, the government of Israel, to the International Criminal Court, I believe it was the ICC they've taken to, for genocide, with very, very detailed evidence of that fact, they say, if you say this in our country, you will be sacked. So you are sacked basically for telling something that most people in the world recognize as truth. That is not a democratic achievement. So finally, what's happening is the suppression of political opposition. There are two parties in America, and neither of them represents what the vast majority of American people want. Polls consistently show the majority of the people in America want a ceasefire in Gaza. But if you stand up for that, you're pilloried, you're sacked. How then is the Biden side dealing with the Trump side? Well, basically by making it impossible for the win by what used to be called lawfare, by taking court decisions to use against Trump. Now, I'm not saying this as a supporter of Trump. What I'm saying is the methods that are being adopted to conduct the political battle are not the methods of democracy. They are the methods of legal suppression, of basically making it impossible for a proper open debate about the issues at stake to take place. So I don't, and I could go on because the same thing is happening in all countries. Macron, I mean, this extraordinary episode in England where Pruella Braverman, the Home Secretary, which is basically head of the security services, tried to ban a demonstration of 1 million people. Fortunately, she was prevented from doing so. And actually, she had to resign, which is a big democratic achievement in my place. But you have Macron wanting to ban the Palestinian flag. You have many countries, particularly Britain, trying to ban strikes. So all the traditional democratic rights that were supposed to be what we are fighting for, the freedoms, the liberty that we're fighting for, are being abolished in the name of democracy. So I don't think what you're seeing at present is a revolutionary process. I think you're seeing something very dangerous, which is the collapse of the pretense of democracy, that the imposition of what America in many what I call a two-party dictatorship. People are always saying, China is very bad because it's a one-party dictatorship, which is not true because there are several parties in China, as we know. But what you have in the United States and Britain is a two-party dictatorship. And the most that one can hope for, and I'm certainly working to this end, but actively, not just academically, is a breakdown in the consensus that the only choice is between these two parties, the lesser evil idea. And none of these countries took principal positions as regards to what was happening in Ukraine, which is just as tragic if you look at what was just as genocidal, if you look at what Ukraine, the government of Kiev, was trying to do to the people, the Russian speakers of Ukraine. It's just as terrible, but they didn't react in that way. They didn't understand what's going on. Now they do. So it's a mixture. Some countries are, maybe the leaders are waking up. Sadly, not enough of them. In other countries, you have political chaos, but what one hopes for is the emergence of a breakdown of the consensus that the only way to get anything done is to vote for one of the two pro-imperial parties. As an economist, one of the first lessons I learned is this: never predict anything, especially the future, because things always surprise you. You cannot tell. What one can do is one can look at trends. Every time in the past history of Britain, when I've attempted to guess what's going to happen, it's happened in a different way. Not so long ago in Britain, one of the forms of expression of the desire for a much more radical programme was the growth of a left-wing Scottish National Party, which is, from 30 years, 20 years I spent in Scotland, the last thing that one would have expected at once. But that's what happened. Corbyn was very unexpected. So you can look at economic trends and say the British economy is in a huge mess. You can also say neither party has solutions that will cure the economy. One can say that the solution that was put forward by Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party has the support of 30 or 40% of the population of Britain. And when you get to such a large percentage of the population that are opposed to what the political leaders say, it's like boiling a kettle when you're trying to keep the lid on. It's a pressure cooker. It will come out in some way. So I think the best thing I can say about the election is expect the unexpected. Look for the unexpected. Don't imagine that things will happen in the way that one traditionally thinks they're going to happen. Work hard, stay calm, be brave, and watch for the signs, as was the slogan on a very interesting, very lovely Canadian radio program about Indigenous people. Stay calm, be brave, and watch for the signs. Without a shadow of doubt, October the 7th. That dwarfs absolutely everything. This has brought to the fore the political incapacity of the West, because it not only inspired millions, tens of millions of people the world over, it broke through the veil of deception that prevails in the West, so that young people came out on the streets and continue to come out on the streets inspired by that. And so we're not putting up with it. We're not putting up with what Israel is doing in response. You're not entitled to kill children, women, and civilians simply because you've been attacked. I think the other thing to say about that's very important is this moral crisis of democracy that I've talked about. One of the phenomena that's happening as a result of the moral crisis of democracy is people are abandoning law. It's a crime. What Israel is doing and has done as occupier of a country containing an indigenous population that was there and shares that land with them historically is a crime. It's an international crime. The indiscriminate attacks on women, children, civilians is a crime. So that is being exposed. And finally, as somebody of a Jewish background, what I think was very, very moving is that Jewish people are now taken to the streets, and Jewish people are saying Judah is not Zionism. They're not the same thing. So that there are veils of deception which have prevailed for such a long time that resistance has produced. So it's not merely a military, it's actually above all a political, a social, and an inspiring human event. And I think nothing could be put on a parallel with that. So I'm going to say that is the event of last year. War is horrible. And the greatest glorifiers of war is the Israeli military apparatus and system. They have stood up in front of the world since the Six-Day War, since before, and said, our principal claim to land is our capacity to mobilize force. They've used force without restraint. The foundation of Israel involved groups that were at the time described as terrorists, such as the Stone Gang. Force has been an element of the current state of Israel since its inception. They have been at war with the people of Israel, and I include the Palestinians as peoples of Israel, since the inception of Israel. Now, then if you look at what the law says, so war is horrible, but let's look at where the war started. A further point that should be made is it's not just the Zionist state, it's the US and Canadians and Britain and the guarantors of the Palestinian settlements that have failed to live up to their international legal obligations. There are now 600,000 illegal settlers in the West Bank. They use force, they shoot people. The videos I've seen, they're now shooting on Palestinian settlers Palestinians of the area who've lived there for thousands of years. Now, the law says that the people of an occupied country have the right to resist. It's not a terrorist attack. I don't agree that the correct description of what Hamas and its supporters, because there are several factions in this, have done, is not war. It's resistance, and resistance is justified. Now, resistance takes forms that we don't find acceptable, but their response to something much less acceptable, they're the product of that. They're the product of desperation. What else is left of them? Every democratic means, every parliamentary means has been undertaken. They concluded the Oslo Accords, and they were not respected. So when all peaceful, all non-harmful processes have been exhausted, nothing is left if you're confronting force but force. So it's very sad, but the solution is to stop using war as a means of imposing power, which is what the West and the Zionist government of Israel, one half of it, because there's an opposition in Israel, a very heroic Jewish resistance, which is opposition, which you now begin to see on the streets of Tel Aviv in mixed forms. But you begin to see that existed for a long time. That's the solution, not to go around saying you don't have the right to resist. Yes, you do have the right to resist. I think that violence is an absolute last resort, and that even when violence is undertaken, it's very important to minimize the damage to the innocent. And I think there's growing evidence. A lot of the harm that was originally attributed to Hamas was in fact not committed by Hamas, that Israel was also responsible for the deaths of many Israelis because of the indiscriminate methods they used. So the truth will come out in due course. We will actually begin this persistent machine of essentially lying about who is responsible for what, which is, what's called the disinformation, or what do they call it, mixed warfare. Misinformation is part of the way that the Western powers go to war now. So we will find out in due course the truth of how much damage the resistance actually caused. One regrets every such damage to people who are not direct parties to the conflict. One regrets it. Nevertheless, that's what happens in war. The issue is whether you seek to minimize that, which I think that is what Hamas is trying to do, and what those who seek to, focus on military targets seek to do. Incidentally, that is what we see in these tit-for-tat escalations in Ukraine, that the attacks on Belgorod, which were conducted by the Kiev regime, were done in daylight on New Year's Eve when everybody was out on the streets. They had no military function whatsoever. Their function was simply to kill as many people as possible and terrorize them. That was a terrorist act. I think Russia, quite correct to characterize that as a criminal terrorist act, to ask the United Nations Security Council to condemn it. If you look at what the Russians are doing, on the whole, I'm not, giving a white sheet, but at least what they claim they're doing, and the evidence suggests that that's largely what they're doing, is to highlight military targets and try and minimize civilian damage. And Putin, in his latest speech, said we have the capacity to carpet bomb Kiev, which everybody has taken as a threat. But he said we're not going to do that because that's not what we do. So if you take people at their word, and if you look at the facts, because Kiev does not deny that it attacks civilians, doesn't deny it, then you say there are two different attitudes to the way that to acts of war in which civilians are killed, which is one is that we use it quite deliberately, which is what actually Ukraine was doing to Donetsk for 11 years before the special military operation, which nobody wept any tears over, and attacking military targets with the risk of collateral damage. So they are different things. Can't mix them all up together. I'm never happy with commemorating individuals. That if I were to say the most memorable, it would be the people of Palestine as a whole, and one would not single out one person above any other. Memorable is a difficult word. It's who comes to memory. And there are certainly two figures that I think have figured very centrally, which are Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. But strangely enough, the figure that probably should be remembered more than is being done is Maduro of Venezuela. Because Maduro and his government were targeted, have been the longest targets, except for Cuba, I think, and Iran possibly, of Western sanctions. And they've come out on top. They've rescued the Venezuelan economy. They have restored some form of political balance. They've achieved the liberation, the complete illegal capture of Alex Saab. It is now the terrorist opposition, people like Guaido, who's pictured on television throwing Molotov cocktails, which is supposed to be wonderful. Nobody said Guaido was a terrorist. He organized soldiers to kill people. He threw Molotov cocktails at people. He took part in very murderous acts against civilians that he is now isolated from his own party and from the government, quite correctly. And this in the face of, the most concerted campaign against Venezuela on the behalf of America, the United States, and Britain particularly, but by including seizure of their gold completely illegally by a so-called court in Britain, all kinds of things. Now the Americans are coming begging and saying, look, excuse me, we want your oil because of what we've done to the Russians. That is nemesis in action. I think the figure that deserves to be known and memorized the most is Nicolas Maduro. And let's not forget Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president as well, who is a towering figure, in my opinion.